so much for that kind intro. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's such a joy to be able to present my work in this space. The paper that I'm going to be presenting today comes, as Quentin mentioned, from a larger project called Literatures of Unbelonging, Abjection and the Problem of Place in Contemporary Southern African Literature. In this project, I'm seeking to develop an analytical language for exploring the relationship between place, well, the relationship with place, and attendant anxieties of belonging in contemporary Southern African writing. This particular paper comes from chapter 4 of this project. So a little bit in. I had to juggle it a little bit, but hopefully it'll all be self-contained and make sense. It comes from chapter 4, which I provisionally called Finding Refuge. This is, as is often the case, a paper that is very much a work in process, probably more so than I'd like. I have done that terrifying thing and followed my own advice. As I often tell people, it's sometimes better to present something that you're working on, because you have the opportunity to receive feedback and incorporate that into your work. So, as much as that has been causing me no small amount of anxiety in the last few days, I hope it'll go well, and hopefully we'll have a fair bit of time at the end for discussion, which, well, hopefully will be very generative. This is a little more literary than many of the papers that I have attended in the CMDR. But the questions that it raises with regard to place and identity will be very familiar to many of you here. And a lot of my thinking has been very productively influenced by a number of the talks and discussions that I've had the privilege to be a part of in this very room as well. So hopefully these are ideas and discussions that we can all engage with together once I'm done. Okay, shall we begin? Questions of place and belonging have long been a central preoccupation in Southern African literature. From Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm, to Solomon T. Plaatje's Moody and Bessie Head's Maru, through to contemporary novels like The Promise by Damon Galgut and Karen Jennings' An Island. I've got a whole bunch of copies of here. Given South Africa's historically problematic spatial politics, this is relatively unsurprising. To borrow from Bessie Head, literature is very functional in Southern Africa and bound inextricably to human suffering. Although this may no longer always be the case, Southern Africa's traumatic past has resulted in an approach to literature that has a tendency to historicize, more often than not approaching texts through a critical lens that is largely informed by the area's social and political history. In the introduction to their influential collection of essays, Post-Colonial Spaces, The Politics of Place in Contemporary Culture, Andrew Towson and Sarah Upston write that the idea that place plays a significant role in how one defines one's own identity, and equally how that identity is defined by others, is continually foregrounded in post-colonial studies. In particular, the colonial manipulation of national boundaries and the subsequent challenge of post-colonial states in forming cohesive identities within the terms of these inherited boundaries have made the nation a central feature in discussions of post-colonial identity. But to think about identity solely in national terms like this is to overly simplify and obscure a relationship that is far more subjective and specific than this sort of discussion allows for. While works like Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities are undoubtedly influential, to reduce relationship between place and identity to terms informed entirely by questions of nationalism and politics runs the risk of becoming, as David Hunter has controversially argued in Post-Colonial Imaginings, involved in prolonging and repeating imperialist subjugation. While I personally feel that Hunter takes this a little too far, it is nevertheless becoming more and more widely acknowledged that we need to be thinking about place and identity in increasingly complex ways. Building on the work of Steve Biko and Edward Said, I have attempted in the larger project to develop Julian Kristeva's concept of abjection as a way of addressing the sort of unbelonging that I argue is inextricably tied to questions of displacement and spatial dissociation that have been emerging in recent Southern African literatures that address questions of migration, xenophobia, and belonging. Particularly when it comes to thinking about ideas like place and belonging, it is important to consider the ways in which context affects theory. To quote Edward Said, to speak here of borrowing and adaptation is not always adequate, because theory travels and is transformed by that travelling. It gains or loses in strength and can become, in any particular historical period and national culture, altogether different from another period or situation. And I think we can refine this idea in increasingly specific and subjective ways. So, the question that I would like to ask today is, how do we approach questions of self and belonging in a text like An Island that is actively dissociated from a recognizable political, geographical, and historical place? It is a text that is, to quote an unknown audience member from a book reading I attended in 2022, a definitively South African novel. And yet, it takes place in a deliberately undefined imaginary geography. It is a text that is both shaped and defined by the indefinite article that forms such an integral part of the title, An Island. Now, I imagine not everyone here has read the novel. I mean, correct? Show of hands, has anyone read the text? Okay, good, then I'll pitch this at the right level. Okay, so I've anticipated that not everyone has read the novel. So I thought it would be good to give you a brief sense of the narrative and setting. I'm not, however, going to be doing this myself, because I think that it's more interesting to begin by looking at the blurb for the South African Caravan Press edition. Now, the blurb for the Caravan Press edition frames the novel in these terms. Samuel has lived alone for a long time. One morning, so Samuel's the main character. One morning he finds the sea has brought someone to offer companionship and to threaten his solitude. A young refugee washes up unconscious on the beach of a small island inhabited by no one but Samuel, an old lighthouse keeper. Unsettled, Samuel is soon swept up in memories of his former life on the mainland, a life that saw his country suffer under colonizers, then fight for independence, only to fall under the rule of a cruel dictator. And he recalls his own part in its history. In this new man's presence, he begins to consider, as he did in his youth, what is meant by land and to whom it should belong. To what lengths will a person go in order to ensure that what is theirs will not be taken from them? A novel about guilt and fear, friendship and rejection, about the meaning of home. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this is not a blurb that Jennings herself has written, but it's an interesting paratext nonetheless, and provides an important insight into the ways in which the novel has been framed in the Southern African context. The South African edition uses language that is more directly reminiscent of colonial discourse than that which we see in other editions. I have the American and British editions here, which have slightly different, they frame the text slightly differently. Samuel in this blurb is unsettled in a place that he himself has settled. And while he does in fact inherit the island from his predecessor, he arrives not as an immigrant, but as a colonizer, seeking to control and violently assert his will on what he perceives as an untamed and wild place. We hear in the opening passages of the novel of the extent to which Samuel has gone in attempting to control and shape his environment. In a passage in which we hear of Samuel's early years on the island, following an incident in which the bodies of 3 children wash up on the shore, we learn that by then he had already started his vegetable garden beside the cottage. He used his wages to import soil from the mainland, had ordered seeds and clippings, and to protect all of that new growth, he had begun to fashion a dry stone wall around it. He gathered all the brick-sized stones of the island, fitting them together one on top of the other, until they were high enough, stretched far enough to form a barrier. After that, he ordered a sledgehammer and broke apart many rocks and boulders that compromised the coastline. Had a helicopter been in the habit of flying over, its pilot would note the widening of the small bays, the curves where serrated edges had once been. We can see in this attempt to tame and shape the island echoes of Robinson Crusoe, or perhaps more aptly J.M. Coetzee's Foe. Samuel is enacting a form of violence on his environment as a means by which to take some sense of control over it. And he does this by breaking rocks and boulders, by building walls, a practice that is as futile as it is absurd on an island. Now, over the course of the 23 years as lighthouse keeper, we learn that 32 corpses have washed up on the island. And in the passage immediately following this one here, we learn that it was into the outer wall that he began to introduce the bodies. With time, he learned to make these parts sturdier, so that they bulged a little around their contents. Even so, sometimes the gulls managed to break through and pick at the body inside. In those places where corpses were left to disintegrate unaided, the stones often collapsed. Not only is Samuel's own attempt to gain some form of control over his environment inevitably doomed, but it is also quite literally destabilized by the very material he is using to build it. The bodies of refugees who wash up on his shores, nameless, homeless, and stripped of their humanity. The novel itself opens with the arrival of a refugee, but in this moment and repeatedly throughout the text, he is described as an inanimate object, a thing, stripped of humanity. So again, this is assuming that not everyone had read the text. So the novel begins, it was the first time an oil drum had washed up on the scattered pebbles of the island shore. With this very amusing story, to highlight a very amusing American pebble which has white sandy beaches. Which if I were Karen, I think I would have been a bit upset by it. Other items had arrived over the years. Ragged shirts, bits of rope, cracked lids from plastic lunch boxes, braids of synthetic material made to resemble hair. There had been bodies too, as there was today. The length of it stretched beside the drum. It is the oil drum that is highlighted in this passage, with the young refugee considered almost as an afterthought. He becomes here an item, an it, a piece of flotsam listed at the end of a catalogue of debris, discarded objects that hint at other lives, at other places. It is the revelation that this thing, this object, is in fact alive, is in fact a person, that provides the inciting incident in the novel. And it is the way in which his arrival destabilizes Samuel's sense of self and threatens to disrupt his relationship with the island that provides the source of tension that drives much of the action for the remainder of the narrative. And it is the rapidly destabilizing relationship between Samuel's sense of self and place that much of the remainder of the novel is concerned with interrogating. In many ways, what we see in An Island is an extension of Jennings's own critical engagement with the writing of J.M. Coetzee, or more specifically, questions of displacement and the relationship between self and place in Coetzee's own writing. At roughly the same time that she was completing the manuscript of An Island, Jennings published an article on J.M. Coetzee's Slow Man in the April 2019 edition of English in Africa. The article is titled, "What is this place where I find myself? Place and self in Slow Man." In it, she uses Jeff Malpass's Place and Experience of Philosophical Typography to argue that the self is identified by its sense of place in the world, complicating Malpass's exploration of place by using Ulrich Neisser's concept of the nested character of place and memory. So we have, I see a few Coetzee scholars in the room, or Wordsworth scholars in fact. This should be beginning to call to mind Wordsworth's spots of time, and some of the ways that Coetzee develops this in relation to the poetry of Guy Butler in his collection of essays, White Writing, on the culture of letters in South Africa. In his essay in this collection, Reading the South African Landscape, Coetzee argues that in moments of alienation, recurring again and again, Butler's memory throws up and his poems relive spots of time that force on him an unsettling realization of his alienness in Africa, perhaps in the world. It is his reinterpretation of Wordsworth's spots of time and Coetzee's awareness of the effect that displacement and consequent estrangement have on subjectivity that informs Jennings' reading of Slow Man. But it is also an idea that is particularly relevant in An Island as well. Before we consider some of the ways in which this sense of displacement that results from the arrival of the refugee on the island affects Samuel's sense of self, I'd like to take a brief moment to return to Melvill. In Place and Experience, he argues that place is that within and with respect to which subjectivity is itself established. Place is not founded on subjectivity, but is that on which the notion of subjectivity is founded. Thus, one does not first have a subject that apprehends certain features of the world in terms of the idea of place. Rather, the structure of subjectivity is given in and through the structure of place. Oh, sorry, I'm not standing in the way, I'll still stand. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Okay, this is an idea that has very interesting implications for how we engage with the novel. Because if we accept the notion that subjectivity is founded on place, or more specifically, on one's relation to and situatedness within a particular place, what happens to the sense of self when this relationship is destabilized, when moments of alienation recur again and again? And this is a process that becomes particularly relevant when we begin to ask about memory and place, and begin to look at some of the ways in which the novel becomes fragmented increasingly as it progresses. In many ways, the experience of reading An Island is mimetic of this sense of displacement and alienation. Not only does the story happen in an undefined and dislocated place, but we are confronted as readers with a text that formally mirrors this thematic concern with displacement. Even the page numbers, which is maybe opportunistic of me to highlight this, even the page numbers are dislocated, displaced, I suppose, works as well. So I don't know if you can see here, but the page numbers even are not in a normal position. They're slightly up, and I have gone through some other Caravan Press publications, and this does happen in some of the other ones. But it's interesting that in the South African edition, even the page numbers are slightly dislocated, printed a quarter of the way up the page. The book itself is ordered into 4 sections: the first day, the second day, the third day, and the fourth day, with these sections becoming increasingly shorter as the narrative progresses and Samuel's sense of self becomes increasingly compromised. These sections or chapters are then fragmented into shorter untitled passages, or perhaps better, spots of time, that jump between what is happening on the island and Samuel's memory of his time before, with the distinction between these two becoming increasingly blurred in the mind of Samuel as he begins to feel more and more threatened and displaced by the young refugee on his island. And of course, all of this is mediated through an impersonal third-person narrative voice that occludes the I in the narrative and by extension denies Samuel's subjectivity to some degree. Now this all begins very early in the text, as the refugee's arrival precipitates a growing sense of alienation, an unheimlichkeit, a weirdness, an uneasiness, an uncanniness in Samuel, who, having brought the young man from the beach and into his house, is forced to confront his changing relationship to a place that had, up to this point, been relatively stable. We can see the beginning of this developing uncanniness, or unheimlichkeit, unhomeliness, already on page 13 of the novel. So we see here, this is a passage just after Samuel he's found this refugee on the beach. He's figured out that the refugee is not in fact a corpse, he's still breathing, and with great effort and a rather extended passage, he brings this person up into his house and settles him there. And so here we have Samuel reflecting on this new presence in his home. How long might the man live? How long would he lie on Samuel's carpet, in Samuel's home? He rattled his fingers on the table, smoothed the hand over his face. Was it to go on like this then, this incessant movement in his home? This home that had been his alone for more than 2 decades of solitude? Was it to be this breath, this pulse, this youth, this life, taking over the small cottage, seeping into the floor and the walls? He began to feel breathless and gasp with panic. Samuel grasps desperately here, attempting to assert his relation to place, to his own home, proclaiming his ownership repeatedly. His home, his alone for more than 2 decades. And this is an impulse that we see repeated with increasing frequency as the narrative progresses, most notably with regard to a kitchen knife and the negative key to his front door. In defiance of Samuel's proclamations of ownership, however, the young man's life, his breath, filled this space, denying Samuel's claim over it, supplanting him as his home becomes increasingly unhomely, uncanny and strange, taking on the life and characteristics of the man himself, to the extent that the building becomes alive, a grotesque personification in Samuel's eyes of the man lying within. It had begun to sign out the cottage. That must have been the feeling in his ears, the doorway sucking in the air of the island, breathing out the stale air of the cottage. The man was alive. Samuel could think of nothing else, only the man's breath, that man's breath. Not of his own frailty and pain, not of his hunger, not even of his desire to be inside, lying on the couch, perhaps to sleep a few moments as his discomfort settled. But he could not enter that gasping hole. To enter it would be to suffocate and die. Samuel's sense of discomfort, his displacement from his own home, results in the first of the textual moments of alienation, in which he is confronted with a sense of not belonging, of being both out of place, and thereby to an extent out of self. We see this very viscerally described at the end of this section, this moment of time, spot of time, as it were. Cool. Oh, that's my son. As Samuel's sense of self, so we see this very viscerally described in this sort of spot of time, this fragment within the novel. As Samuel's sense of self, his very belonging is corporeally stretched, losing shape and form, as he becomes, in a sense, bodily dislocated in this moment. So this is the end of this passage in which the refugee has been placed in Samuel's home. Inside him, something small, and folded began to shift. It opened upwards, growing even larger, until his chest, his arms, his throat were wrapped in it, until he was brittle and creaking with it. He reached up, but could feel only the rasp of fingers on stubble and beneath the paper skin. No, he could not enter the cottage, nor could he return to the beach, not on these tired legs. And even if he had been able, he would not go. Not now that it had become a place of dread. The unfolding continued, and he was stretched thin by it, so thin and formless that he might at any moment be taken up by the wind and removed. If we return to the blurb that I read at the beginning of this talk, you might remember that this is a text that is described as being about the meaning of home. So what then does home mean here for Samuel? Because even though this is a space that is undefined and indefinite to us as readers, for Samuel this is his island, his home, and his alienation both within and from the place that he calls home has a very definite impact on him. But of course, as we very quickly begin to see, the same sense of dislocation and displacement starts much earlier in Samuel's life, as his memories begin to encroach increasingly on Samuel's perception of events taking place in his present moment. One of Jennings's core arguments in her paper on slow manner is that part of the way in which we experience place and our relationship to it is through our capacity to act, in relation to objects within the world. But what we see in Samuel is an inability to relate to these objects, as objects and people become confused in his perspective, and he in turn becomes unable to relate successfully with his environment. As the text progresses, Samuel is increasingly beset by homicidal thoughts. I won't ruin what happens in the novel. But in the opening section of the third day, Samuel thinks, looking at the young man sleeping on his couch, how easy it would be to shoot the man. How easy to simply lift his arm and shoot him as he slept. Afterwards, he would not bury the man within the island's stone wall. No, this body would be returned to the site where it had beached itself. Samuel would wade out with it as far as he could, let the waves take it. Watch them carry it back to where it had come from. He would have to wipe down the walls, probably burn the couch. He lifted his arm, fired. It was done. Only he had no gun, and the man still lived. Samuel looked away. Samuel here is unable to act in relation to the objects of his environment. And this is the way he continues to consider the refugee here. You see that slippage between personhood and the it, the body, the corpse, this sort of uncanny relationship between the person and the potentiality of his death. He moves in Samuel's mind the refugee very quickly from the he into the it and this body. A body that is so disruptive that Samuel hypothetically denies it even a possible place in his absurd boundary wall. It needs to be forcibly removed from the island, returned to the indefinite, ever-changing sea. It is Samuel's inability to act, to engage with the person that has disrupted his home and space in this moment, that precipitates a form of subjective displacement in Samuel. Displacement, and Samuel continues to lose touch with reality. As Samuel looks away from the corporeal reality that is the young man sleeping on his couch, he imagines the man's family arriving on the island, but not as people. He imagined opening the front door, being confronted by their approach. All those bodies from the sinking boat. So the refugees washed up from a boat that sunk offshore. There's another body that washes up as well, but he's the only survivor that washed up on the shore. So those bodies from the sinking boat, dripping, sea-tossed, their clothes patchworked with salt, climbing over the walls, hunching up the sandy inclines across the long yellow grass. And along with them, others more sinister, skeletons from inside the wall, pushing their way out, causing the rocks to disintegrate as they rose and came from him. He was mad, it was certain. The dizziness, the fall, the visions of nightmares came to life. All the memories and the man here, it was making him ill. So we see an example here of this sense of uncanny being developed here by Jennings in relation to the figure of the refugee, as the environment itself becomes disrupted by the bodies which are coming to life, the bodies that form a part of this absurd boundary wall that he put himself, and thereby disrupting that sense of control he had over the place. And parallel very directly with this is a disruption of Samuel's own sense of sanity. His own sense of being and belonging to that place is disrupted along with his own sense of sanity. Samuel's displacement here transcends the real, as the real becomes itself uncanny, displaced in a way that brings to mind Coetzee reading of Butler. Alienated, but alienated here from reality and unsettled by his aliens, both with relation to himself as well as in relation to the world around him. Samuel in this moment becomes confronted by abjection, by the state of being cast off, by being separated from society and normalized social morality. He himself becomes violently confronted with that which has been cast out of the cultural world, having once been the subject, in this case as seen through the skeletons and the corpse. And it is perhaps in this moment that we begin to see the process whereby Samuel himself becomes sufficiently alienated from both place and self that he is capable of acting in the way he does at the end of the novel. I think I've raced through that a little bit quickly. I'm going to end there because I don't want to discuss the very end of the novel because I think it's important that everyone goes and reads this. But the ending is very affecting and quite difficult in some ways. But it's a process that Jennings walks us up to through these moments, these stops in time, this dislocation and this dissociation with the real that she develops as the novel progresses, to the extent that Samuel himself becomes less and less grounded in the real, less and less grounded in social morality, in social norms, and becomes more and more dissociated and dislocated. I haven't really discussed the figure of the refugee today, which is something that I do in greater length in the paper, but I think that would have been a whole another half hour. And I thought I'd rather have maybe some discussion about it, because I think it's, as I said, the work is very much in process, so it's always really valuable to test these things out, as it were, but also to maybe engage with some feedback. So, I mean, thank you very much. I hope that's